Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at our Ranger multi-class tier guide list. And I think Ranger is as a class that, maybe with the exception of Sorcerer, I think Sorcerer has benefited a lot from, more material being released. Expanding spells known and stuff is a huge boost for them. But Ranger is definitely up there for one of the most improved classes in the game. And I think a lot of people still have this idea that Rangers are just bad. I still hear that a lot, and I very strongly disagree with that these days. I think that Rangers are quite good, and obviously, anytime you think Ranger, it seems to be people's natural response to think Gloomstalker, and I gotta admit, I fall into that category myself as well. But the truth is, there's some pretty good Ranger subclasses and a lot of nice options. And some of the new optional class features we got from Tashes really help a lot as well. They are optional. Your campaign may not allow them, but if they do, like Favorite Foe is way better than Favorite Enemy. And it's just a static boost your damage. I'll just read it out quickly for those of you who haven't bothered to look at Ranger since Tasha came out. But when you hit a creature with an attack roll, you can call on your Mystic Bond with Nature to mark the target as your favorite enemy for 1 minute or until you lose your concentration as if you were concentrating on a spell. The first time on each of your turns you hit your favorite enemy and deal damage to it, including when you mark it, you can increase that damage by 1d4. And you can do this a number of times. You can do proficiency bonus, get them all back on a long rest, and the damage increases to 1d6 at 6th level and 1d8 at 14th level. So not a lot of scaling, but 1d6 at 6th isn't so bad. The main thing is though, this doesn't require an action, a bonus action, or anything. You just hit the target and you can deal extra damage to it a number of times per day equal to the proficiency bonus. That's pretty good, especially considering that favored enemy wasn't really so great. The Deft Explorer and the Candy abilities, both pretty good. I'm not going to read them all, but just if you haven't looked at Ranger lately, and by lately I mean since Tasha's came out like a year ago, but to be fair, a lot of times you're playing a long campaign. You're not making characters like every, week or two, right? Like you might be playing the same character for a year or more. And if you've always had this idea that Rangers are weak or Rangers are bad, I do think a lot of that has changed. So I wanted to say that out front that I actually think that there's some pretty strong Ranger subclasses. That being said, I still think Rangers are a very, very good option for multi-classing. Partly because I find that while Rangers do have a lot of decent abilities past level 5 or 6, I do think they tend to slow down a bit as well. Those first 5 levels are really, really good. We're getting, extra attack by then. We've got second level spells, which gives us things like Pass Without Trace. We've also got a bunch of new spells that were added by Tasha's now that are just on like every Ranger spell list. And a lot of these are really good, like Entangle at first level. At second level, we get Aid, Enhanced Ability, Magic Weapon can be okay. Summon Beast is quite good though. Rangers have way better summoning spells than most of the other half casters do. I mean, heck, better than some full casters do, to be honest. Level 3, you get like Elemental Weapon, Revivify, Summon Fae. I mean, there's some really, really nice options on that list, and they're available to all Rangers now. And then a lot of the newer subclasses have their own spell lists as well. So, you can get some decent spell casting, even with like a 5 or 6 or 9 level investment into Ranger. You're getting extra attack. They're very nice for like ranged damage builds, especially. I just think that they're a pretty decent base class. Now, much like I said under Paladin, these multi-classes may end up with more of whatever the other class is than Ranger. But for purposes of these builds, when I say we're going to be going Ranger, I really think we're going to be taking like that Ranger as our base kind of core. And even if we eventually end up with more like Cleric or whatever else it ends up being, the idea is that we're taking our 5 levels of Ranger or more, we're getting extra attack, we're getting some second level spells, and then we're going to try to, add whatever else to it, right? So, don't get hung up on the exact level breakdown or anything like that. The main idea is I'm going to be using a bow or a hand crossbow with Crossbow Expert or something along those lines. I could make a strength-based Ranger. We will talk about a couple of those ideas. It can work. Be aware, though, that it does get a little mad because, you are requiring 13 Dex and 13 Wisdom to multi-class in or out of Ranger. And then if you need Strength on top of that, that can start getting a little high. We're also going to need some Constitution probably. If we're going a Strength build, we're probably going to be in melee. Unless we're doing like a throw-in weapon build, that could use Strength. That can work. But in general, Rangers really lend themselves well to like ranged damage builds. And frankly, ranged builds are awesome in 5th edition, so there's no problem with that at all. Anyways, let me quickly go over what I usually say at every one of these videos. I have 3 main reasons I like to multi-class. Number 1 is to become even better at whatever my core proficiency was supposed to be. Usually by combining different classes and then like doubling up on that feature, right? So, one class gives me like advantage maybe, and then another class gives me like expanded crit range or something like that. And then by combining them together, I get the best of both, right? Reason number 2 is to cover for core weaknesses in the class. And I think Ranger is one of these ones where, because we don't have heavy armor, this can sometimes be a nice boost, especially if we wanted to have heavy armor. Maybe we don't care about the strength requirement. Maybe we're planning on playing a melee ranger, like I said. Then getting heavy armor from somewhere, like maybe even from a war cleric or something, for example, can be a nice pickup, right? Reason number 3 is to add more utility to the class. And rangers are a class that have quite a bit of utility already. But that being said, combining a ranger with, say, like rogue for cunning action, or, some of these other, like, more spell casting from, say, like a druid or a cleric who both use wisdom and make good options there. These can really add a lot to the class as well. So I think that ranger works as both a good base class for us to, like, build around, but also gives us some pretty good options to combine with other classes and, improve even further. So as always, I'll be ranking all the classes and subclass combinations on a scale from A, B, C, D, and E, with the S tier reigning supreme above them all, of course. This is pretty common on the internet. I'm sure you've seen it a million times before. Hopefully you've seen it several times in my own videos, but maybe you haven't. That's fine. Anyways, like I always say though, I do tend to be pretty particular with what I put in like the S tier. So if I say something's an A and you think it's an S, or if I say something's a D but you think it's actually an E, that's fine. Don't get too hung up on it. This is just my opinion. It doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong. And I'm not using like a D plus or a D minus. So there is like flexibility within these, right? Is a D plus really that much worse than a C minus? Yeah, who knows? Anyways, I'm kind of pressed for time today, so I'm going to have to hurry into things and not expand as much as I usually do, but that's all right, hopefully. So, as always, we'll go in alphabetical order, and starting with Artificer. So, Artificer does give us some pretty useful spells. It gives us some nice infusion options. I really like this in a campaign where maybe my Dungeon Master doesn't really tailor items to me. Let's say I wanted to use the hand crossbow, like I said. Hand crossbow with crossbow expert is really great. The problem is, magical hand crossbows tend to be incredibly rare. So unless your DM's like, oh hey, here's a +1 short bow, but the ranger is using a hand crossbow, so I'm just going to change it to a hand crossbow. If your DM doesn't want to do that, you may need to find your own ways of making magical hand crossbows. And one way could be to grab some Artificer levels and use one of your infusions on your weapon. So I do think that that can be pretty useful, but it is rather multiple attribute dependent again. Your bonus action as a ranger tends to be pretty busy, even if you're not using Hunter's Mark. In the example I just gave, crossbow expert with a hand crossbow is giving you a bonus action attack potentially every round. And one of the draws usually of Artificer to me is that all the subclass features give me cool things I can do with a bonus action. But if my bonus action is already pretty spoken for, and every round almost I've got like multiple choices, adding more choices to that list isn't really helping me because I can still only do one of them on any given turn, right? And, usually I'm of the opinion that more options is better than less, but if I'm having a multi-class into it to get those options and then I'm not using them consistently, suddenly I'm giving up a lot for an option that I'm not even able to use consistently, perhaps. So in the end, I'm going to give Artificer a D, but let's bear in mind that if you're in a campaign where you can't necessarily get like the certain weapon you're looking for, then Artificer can be a nice way to overcome that problem. And in those cases, I think I would rate Artificer quite a bit higher. But in most campaigns, that doesn't usually be an issue, so we're going to put them in the D. Next, we have the Barbarian. And this obviously lends itself quite well to strength-based builds, right? You're getting rage, you're getting reckless attack. These things aren't as good on a ranged character because reckless attack requires you to be like up front and smashing people. It requires you to be using strength to those attacks as well. So, you know, even if you did want to use ranged weapons, you're probably out of luck there. Medium armor that Barbarian is limited to doesn't really hurt because you're a ranger anyways, so that's okay. It is a little multi-attribute dependent, but if you just wanted to go with like a 13 or 14 dex, and just go mostly strength, that can work. I think that rage and reckless attack are both so strong that if I was going to go with a melee focused ranger, those are pretty good options. You know, grab like Great Weapon Mastery. Since I'm going to be raging some of the time, I can't concentrate on spells. So things like Hunter's Mark lose a lot of value. But you can grab Great Weapon Mastery plus Pull-On Mastery, and then you're using your Pull-On for that bonus action attack all the time anyway. You don't need Hunter's Mark. I sometimes think that people over-rely on Hunter's Mark anyways. Well, it's a good spell. I do think that people kind of overrate it sometimes. So, just throwing that out there. Either way, I think that if you wanted to make a strength-based character, this is one of your best options. And I would rate the Barbarian in the B tier. You'd probably be even higher if it wasn't for the fact that it really limits you to like strength-based builds, essentially, right? And, that's okay though. Like I said, if you want to play that type of character, that could be pretty cool still. And I think that Rangers have enough of these like newer options that it is still pretty viable. So next we're moving on to Bard. Bard, of course, is going to give us some more skills. It's going to give us Jack of all trades. It's going to give us some spells. However, it also is quite multiple attribute dependent because now we're going to require charisma. Overall, I think that adding some more skills and perhaps expertise and stuff are pretty good. And if you just want to take a little bit of Bard, I don't think this is bad by any means. There's also like some rather niche builds where you may want Jack of all trades just for the initiative boost. Like imagine a Gloomstalker Ranger combined with Assassin, and in the first round of combat, if you're acting before your enemies have, you get advantage on all those attacks. So let's say that you'd made a character where you specifically took like say Elven Accuracy, and now your idea is you just want to have as high initiative as you can, attack in that opening round with that extra attack from Gloomstalker on top of that, of course, and just get advantage or super advantage, in this case, on all those attacks. And then you're like, hey, why not grab 2 levels of Bard at some point, just for Jack of all trades, and now I'm getting half my proficiency bonus rounded down, added to my initiative as well. Maybe throw in the alert feat, and suddenly you've got a character who's attacking very quickly. But in that case, I kind of look at it as the Bard's just kind of like rounding out what's really a Gloomstalker Assassin build, right? The Bard's just kind of the icing on the cake in that case. So overall, I'm going to say the Bard is probably a C, but I think it's kind of a lower C maybe. I was kind of bordering on D, but I do think that expertise and Jack of all trades and getting some more spellcasting progression, those things are all good enough that I think it still merits a C. And like I said, in some specific builds, I think that it can be pretty useful as well, right? Anyways, moving on to Cleric. Cleric, of course, I've already mentioned it a little bit. It shouldn't be surprising, though, that having a Wisdom full caster added to a Wisdom half caster is pretty synergistic. Channel divinities, domain features, more spells, potentially grabbing heavy armor from one of the many cleric subclasses that give heavy armor these days. That's all pretty good. There's some really nice combinations, like, say, a life cleric dip, both for heavy armor, but also for things like Goodberry to heal more. You know, you've got some decent healing spells in general from the Ranger kit. Making those better with a small Cleric investment is pretty nice. Nature Cleric is a pretty obvious fit and has some really nice synergy as well. You could go like War Cleric and use that with Sharpshooter to help overcome the -5 hit penalty. Quite good. Spiritual Weapon gives you a decent non-concentration spell for damage. And if you're not using, let's say, like hand crossbow, or let's say you're not wanting to use, like let's say you're just using a bow, like longbow, for example, right? You know, Hex is using concentrate, or it's not Hex, sorry, Hunter's Mark might use your concentration, but Spiritual Weapon doesn't. That does require a little more setup. I don't think it's great for every fight, but if it's like the big bad evil guy and I know this is going to be a long fight, then, you know, throwing down a Spiritual Weapon in round 1 and then following it up with a Hunter's Mark or vice versa can be a decent way to just boost that damage up. And I don't think it's great for every build. Like I said, I tend to favor ones where I'm using my bonus action a lot anyways, and Spiritual Weapon doesn't always fit there. But it's a good enough spell that it's at least worth mentioning, I think. And in a build where I'm not constantly using my bonus action to attack with, this becomes a decent option. Overall, I really like the idea of taking the 5 levels of Ranger just to get extra attack and combining that with Cleric for more spell casting. And I think it's really solid. So I'm going to say this one is an A ranking. I do find that some of the higher level Cleric spells, while still really powerful, are not as game changing as like high level Wizard spells. And that's another reason why I might want this combination, because I don't feel like I'm giving up as much on the high-end Cleric end as I would be if I was like a Wizard, right? You know, so taking more Ranger levels isn't really so bad. And a lot of the Cleric combinations can give you slight boost to your damage, you know, by giving you like damage to your martial weapon attacks. It's not huge, but, you know, it's not nothing either. It's definitely worth mentioning. And it works with bows in most of those cases. So, you know, all in all, not too bad at all. Next, we have the Druid. And this seems like it would be another perfect fit, kind of like Cleric. And while it's very good, I actually think Cleric is a little bit better. Druid does limit us to not being able to wear metal armor, which may suck. It does give us some more spells, of course. It gives us Wild Shape. But because we're multi-classed, our Wild Shaping isn't going to be as strong. And I find that Rangers tend to be very stealthy and scouty anyways. So adding like Wild Shapes isn't always as advantageous. We also might have animal companions or summoned creatures that we could rely on that can cover a lot of the scouting or other details that we might have wanted to do with Wild Shape. So where often I might want Wild Shape just for some out of combat exploration type stuff, I don't think the Ranger benefits from that as much because they have a lot of other options that can also like kind of cover that gap. Also, another disadvantage of Druid over Cleric, or compared to Cleric, not over Cleric, is that there's so much like significant overlap on the spell list. So it's nice that they both use Wisdom, but I've already got like Goodberry, I've got Pass Without Trace, I've got, you know, a Tangle. I've got a lot of like really, really nice options from the Druid spell list that are already on the Ranger spell list. Whereas with the Cleric, I find that, yes, there's still some overlap, of course, but there's a lot less, meaning that I'm able to grab some of the nice things from both spell lists, and, you know, it's just expanding the list so much more. Whereas with Druid, it's like, oh, I'm expanding it a bit, but a lot of the nice stuff I already had as options. Still, though, I think there's some really cool combinations, like a Shepherd Druid to help boost summoning spells that we might want to use on the Ranger in combat. Great idea. I think that this Swarm Keeper combined with the Spores Druid is pretty cool as well, because our swarms actually are like spore type creatures. I think there's some neat themes there, but I also think they mesh quite well. So I don't want to sound like I'm being too negative. I still give this one a B ranking. I think that it's still very strong. I just feel like Cleric is offering a little bit more in this case. Mostly because Ranger already gives us so much from the Druid list anyways, right? Still not bad at all. Next we have the Fighter. So this is going to give us another fighting style. It's going to give us Action Surge, possibly archetypes, and why wouldn't we grab an archetype? I I wouldn't bother going past 5 in both because extra attacks are going to stack. We start losing a lot. If you want more attacks, I think heavy fighter and then adding a bit of ranger is good, but that's more of a fighter build, and we've already covered that under fighter. We're looking at rangers, so maybe just, getting a bunch of attacks from ranger and then just adding an action surge and maybe, expanding crit range from champion or some maneuvers from battle master or some cool abilities from Rune Knight. These things are all pretty good. And the truth is, there's a lot of fighter subclasses that offer us quite a bit. I've already mentioned, Battle Master, Champion, of course, Rune Knight, and those are all strong. But you've also got Arcane Archer, which is a pretty obvious mix with Ranger, pretty good. You've got the Eldritch Knight, if you just wanted cheap access to things like the Shield spell. And, Eldritch Knight is one where you can grab a few spells that don't really need intelligence. And so that can be fine, right? We're not having to add a bunch of extra stats to what we're needing. It's not making us suddenly multiple attribute dependent. Shield doesn't care what your intelligence is. Absorb elements doesn't care, there are some good options there. So I think that those are all pretty strong. One I specifically wanted to mention, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail because I'm actually planning on making a video on this build idea, but Gloomstalker, again, don't worry, it's not going to be all Gloomstalker. My next couple of videos, we're going to look at some other subclasses that aren't Gloomstalker and remind people that other options exist in the game. But in this case, Gloomstalker is really good with fighter because that extra attack Gloomstalker gives us actually works with action surge to give us 2 extra attacks in that opening round. So imagine, say, a Gloomstalker fighter who's using, say, a bow, for example. You get 2 attacks normally, but you get 3 in the opening round, and then you action surge, and now suddenly you're making 6 attacks in that opening round. Maybe you've taken Battle Master for precision attack, and you're able to use that to help overcome some of those sharpshooter penalties. And suddenly you're attacking a lot. Maybe you even went hand crossbow with crossbow expert, and now you've got a bonus action attack on top of that for 7 attacks in the opening round on a 5th level ranger, 3rd level fighter. So you're level 8, making 7 attacks in the opening round of combat. That's pretty crazy. Overall, I feel like fighter is a solid A, but I do think the Gloomstalker Battle Master I just mentioned is probably an S. So let's put a special caveat for them. As great as all the other ones are, getting double the use out of that opening round attack from Gloomstalker is even better. And that extra attack also does an extra D8 damage on top of that. Let's not forget that. So, 2 extra attacks for an extra 2 die 8 plus everything else on top of that is pretty insane. So yeah, fighter is a solid A, and even better in some cases. Monk. Monk gives us a potential armor class boost. If we have a high enough wisdom, that can be okay. You get monk features, of course. You're going to get some key points. Going with something like Kensai and using that to help overcome sharpshooter can be okay. I will say, though, that I think this build works better as a mostly monk with a bit of ranger rather than mostly ranger with a bit of monk. And the main reason is because we just don't have enough key points otherwise to be able to fuel our abilities. If we only have 3 or 4 levels of monk, it's occasionally useful, but it's hard to sell that to me over, say, the Battle Master with precision attack, where we can do kind of a similar thing, and, we've got a bunch of superiority dice. If we save them almost exclusively for precision attack, plus we're getting action surge and another fighting style. We've got a bonus action self-heal we might find occasionally useful. Even things like trip attack, which can technically trip flyers. I know, it's ridiculous, but I just call it winging attack. I hit them in the wing and they plummet down. Battle Master offers quite a bit on a ranger class, to be honest, on any class, to be fair. So I do think there's some potential here. I'm still going to give it a B because there are some pretty nice uses, and getting more mobility and stuff is never bad. I even think that Monk's one of the rare cases where I might consider going to level 5 in both, even though the extra attack doesn't stack. Stunning Strike is pretty decent still, and if I've got an okay Wisdom, it can still land sometimes. If I'm playing a ranged build, it's not as reliable, but yeah, you know, I mean, I gotta get up close and personal probably, but you know, it can still be okay. So, like I said, in the end, I'm going to give it a B, but I think it's kind of a lower tier B. And I do think that the Monk with Ranger is stronger than the Ranger with Monk. Anyways, moving on to Paladin. There are some really cool niche builds here, but overall, there's some real problems. And the biggest problem, of course, is that in order to do this, you require 13 Strength, 13 Charisma from Paladin, 13 Dex, 13 Wisdom from the Ranger, and you're probably going to have to play a melee build since you're a Paladin, meaning you're going to need some Constitution on top of all that. So 4 13s and none of them are con. That's not usually a great starting point. Now maybe you rolled for stats and you rolled well, in which case it works a little bit better. You know, Paladin's still giving you smites, it's giving you a fighting style. Potentially an Oath could be giving you heavy armor if you started Paladin. In general, though, I think that both Fighter and Barbarian can do the same thing, but better, and without requiring us to like have such insane stats. It kind of eliminates a lot of the ranged build options. So Paladin, for me, unfortunately, is going to get a D. I wanted to like it more, but I just think there's better choices out there. And mostly because, you know, the stat requirements are just ridiculous. So, moving on to Rogue. Needless to say, Rogue is a very nice fit with Ranger. That's not going to surprise anybody, I don't think. More skills, expertise, of course, cunning action, probably an archetype, because why not? Sneak attack damage, also great. It shouldn't come as a surprise that being able to like hide and then attack people with advantage with a bow combines well with things like elven accuracy. You know, there's a lot of strong options here that we can use. I think Assassin, I've already mentioned Assassin earlier, you know, especially in the opening round of combat, getting advantage on all those attacks is pretty good. If you're able to surprise an enemy, getting auto crits, of course, is even better. You know, pretty good stuff there. The Scout has some very nice options. If you want to play a melee character, Swashbuckler is actually pretty good for that. Especially if you want to make a skirmisher, you know, maybe just like dip in and dip out. Swashbuckler is pretty good. Scout gives you some like nice kiting options where even if something does try to get on top of you, after they attack you, you can like get a free disengage with your reaction and just move back again and then keep shooting them. If you're using Crossbow Expert, it's not quite as good because you wouldn't have had disadvantage. But let's say you're using a bow, in which case now you've got your free disengage. You know, you don't have to bother moving. You're not firing with disadvantage. You're not eating opportunity attacks. Scout's really good for that kind of stuff. The Soul Knife, with their like psychic walkie-talkie type of thing, that's really good for scouting, so you still have communication with your party, and that way if you get in trouble, they're not like, oh, what happened to the Ranger? And then, you know, 2 hours later, they find your body, and they're like, oh, I guess that's what happened to the Ranger. Too bad he couldn't tell us that he was in danger, you know? Arcane Trickster, of course, giving us some of the same stuff that we talked about with the Eldritch Knight. You know, shield spell, absorb elements, you know, that kind of stuff is pretty good. Possibly a familiar, but like I said, Rangers don't really, you know, you have other options like Beast Companions and whatnot, summoned animals. Familiar is still good though, so, you know, throwing that out there as well. I think the Horizon Walker and Phantom have a cool theme and some synergistic abilities. I like that combination. I already mentioned Gloomstalker, Assassin, but they fit so well together. Not just because of the opening attack either. I think I forgot to mention this. But Gloomstalker gets a bonus to their initiative equal to their wisdom mod. And, you know, since I'm trying to act before my opponents in round one to give myself advantage in all those attacks, you know, getting my dex bonus plus my wisdom bonus to my initiative is even better. So those two fit very, very well together as well. Overall, Rogue is another solid A. There's so much great stuff between them that, you know, it's just a gold mine. Moving on to Sorcerer. Sorcerer gives us more spell options. Maybe Scales if you went with Draconic Ancestry, which honestly I think is probably one of your better options here, right? So that could potentially give you, I mean, it also gives you just more hit points, maybe better armor class, you know, that can be okay. Gives us some more meta magic, of course. The only problem here is that, like, I talked about meta magic quite a bit under Paladin, because I feel like Quicken Spell combined with Paladin is so good. Being able to make your full complement of attacks while being able to still buff yourself or debilitate your enemies or whatever else is amazing. The problem is that we've already mentioned, Rangers tend to have a lot of options in their bonus action phase. And so you just don't have the same kind of value from Quicken Spells that, say, a Paladin would have had. There may be certain builds where you're still able to gain from that a lot, especially like bow builds, you might not be using it as much. But overall, again, now you're needing charisma on top of everything else. If you want to actually, like, there's a difference between dipping a class, like we said with Arcane Trickster or with Eldritch Knight, where, you know, sure you need int for some things, but if you're not like making attack rolls using your int or forcing people to make saving throws that use your int as a spell save DC, your int doesn't really matter that much, right? And especially in those classes where intelligence isn't a requirement of multi-classing in or out of the class. With Sorcerer, we need charisma, and anything we might want to cast, especially if we have a lot of Sorcerer levels, we're probably going to be targeting guys using charisma saves or using charisma for like an attack roll. And it's just not great. And then, like I said, if I'm dipping Sorcerer just a bit, there's not the kind of like huge draw for the meta magic that there might have otherwise been. That said, I still think it's better than Wizard, which we'll get to in a minute. So I'm giving it a D, but it's not the worst option. It's just close to it. Next we have Warlock. Warlock, of course, gives us some of the same problems we just mentioned with Sorcerer. It's giving us spells, but the spell slots don't stack with the Ranger spells. They're a separate category. That can be good, or it could be bad, depending on how you want to look at it. Either way, it's not exactly a perfect fit. We're getting some invocation options, maybe a pack choice. There is some redundancy, like Hunter's Mark and Hex, basically the same thing, so there's no point having both. But we could take like Armor of Shadows to boost our armor class, which is pretty strong. Devil Sight, of course, especially if we went like Human or Halfling or, you know, anybody else who doesn't have Dark Vision, right? I'm not necessarily saying Darkness plus Devil Sight combo, although that's on the table. I'm not a big fan of that combo these days, but that's because I've had a couple bad experiences with party members screwing everybody else over with it. But, you know, just as a way to get Dark Vision on a race that doesn't have it, it's very, very nice, you know? It is rather mad, though. Again, we're needing charisma. Eldritch Smite, though, can work with ranged weapons, so that's one advantage it has over, say, the Paladin, of course. The problem with Eldritch Smite is that we could also knock something prone, which is now giving us disadvantage on ranged weapon attacks. So, you know, keep that in mind. Maybe do it on the last attack of the round. I do think, though, that some of the invocations offer a lot. The fact that the pack magic spells don't stack can be good if we're just looking for a small bit of Warlock spells, like maybe we just wanted to grab Shield from the Hexblade. And now we've got some first level spell slots or second level spell slots, and we can switch back and forth between the Warlock ones or the Ranger ones. The Hexblade also gives us things like Hexblade's Curse, which could be pretty handy, especially if we're, you know, it could be better than Hunter's Mark, for example. And attacking with our Charisma instead of Dex in certain specific builds could be an advantage as well, right? So I think it's better than Sorcerer, but I don't think it's great. So we're giving it a C ranking. Warlock has a lot of advantages over some of the other classes because the invocations make it such a flexible class, right? You're not just looking to spell list, you've also got a bunch of other abilities that you can tailor make to whatever you want, and it just tends to make some pretty strong combinations. And even in combinations like this, where it's not particularly strong, you can still usually find ways to take advantage of it. So finally, that brings us to Wizard. And as I already hinted at with Sorcerer, Wizard's not a great fit. I mean, now we're using intelligence instead of charisma, but we're not even getting meta magic, which might have situationally been good. Like I said, we could get a familiar, but we could have gotten a familiar other ways. And as I've already mentioned, while familiars are great, I think that Ranger has a lot of other things that can kind of fill that same role, including potentially a Beast Companion, which is better than a familiar, to be honest. So I don't think there's a lot of really natural synergy there. And, Wizards do have the best spell list in the entire game overall. There is some potential in a specific build where you deliberately hey, I'm going to take this and this, whatever, right? But just in general, there's not a lot of great synergy. Although I've been mentioning War Wizard in all these videos because 2-level War Wizard dip turns out to be really good. And it's still good here too. But if you're playing a ranged character, especially like a ranged martial, a lot of the other War Wizard dips have been things where you're up in melee combat and being able to add +2 to your armor class or +4 to a save is awesome. But if I'm fighting at distance, and especially if I'm using say a longbow or something, I'm usually not getting targeted and focused down by the enemies. So the armor class boost is pretty situational, to be honest. And I mean, the saving throw bonus is always good, of course. So there is that. But overall, I think Wizard's a D. I wouldn't say it's an E still. The Wizard spell list, even at low levels, does give us some really nice options. And adding ritual casting and stuff is never bad. But overall, again, I just think that there's so many other classes which just offer us way more. It was kind of close to being put in the E category, but we'll go with a D. I think it's good enough that it can merit a D. So, final grades. In the S tier, we have our Gloomstalker Battlemaster, and we probably have Gloomstalker Assassin as well. I forgot to mention that under Rogue, but I think that combination can probably get put up there. Next in the A tier, we have our General Fighters, of course, and we also have the Rogue. Then we have the Cleric. In the B tier, we have the Barbarian, the Druid, and the Monk. In the C tier, we have the Warlock and the Bard. In the D tier, we have our Artificer, with the caveat that you might want infusions in some campaigns, right? We have the Sorcerer, the Paladin, and the Wizard. And in the E tier, we have nothing. So that brings us to the end of the Ranger. I feel like, Ranger is a pretty strong base class to build from and to, combine with other classes. There are a few S tier options, I think. They tend to be specific, subclass combined with specific subclass type of builds, It's not just like Paladin was with Warlock and Sorcerer, where just every single one of them is basically S tier, and then some specific subclasses are even at the top of S tier, right? I don't think that it's that strong, but the Ace options are very, very strong, and there's some S tier options as well. There's nothing that's absolutely awful, I don't think. I mean, Wizard probably coming the closest, and Sorcerer not too far ahead of them. And Paladin. Okay, there are some that are pretty bad. But, there's a lot of pretty strong options here. And, overall, I think it's pretty good. So, my next few videos, and we'll probably do a few of these, because I've kind of neglected some of the Ranger subclasses. And I do want to go through and just talk about some of them. And like I said, I think it's really easy to treat the Gloomstalker as the default. I'm guilty of that myself, right? But there are some other nice options as well. And that's not to knock on Gloomstalker, because the reason we treat Gloomstalker as a default is because Gloomstalker is awesome. We all know it's awesome. I mean, it just is, But my point is, there are other great options as well. So I'm going to be doing a multi-class build, which is going to use Gloomstalker, but I'm also going to be doing some videos covering some of the other subclasses that I haven't talked about yet, and we'll be exploring those in a bit more detail. And, once we're done Ranger, we'll be moving on to Rogue and, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. We're starting to see the end of this series finally, but it's still a ways away, trust me. But that's okay, So anyways, hopefully I've given you something to think about, and that's basically everything I have for this video. So feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. I always read every comment. I don't always comment back, but I read every comment I get. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.